Hello. So this is apparently a speech given by A.M. Rosenthal of the New York Times at November 18th, 1981. He spoke at Colby College in Waterville, Maine, at a convention honoring the memory of Elijah Parrish Lovejoy, a Colby graduate of 1826, who died defending his printing press against a mob violently opposed to his stand on the abolition of slavery. The title says, A.M. Rosenthal of the New York Times defines freedom of the press. Let me tell you a little true story about how a reporter I knew operated. Every day, he would go out and cover his beat in the best way he knew and the only way he knew, by talking to people in the town about what concerned them, about the cost of living, about the feel of life, about what they thought about their leaders, about politics. Every night, that reporter went home, wrote a story, and then carefully burned his notes or flushed them down the toilet. It was a pity, because he knew he might forget what he couldn't write that day if he burned his notes, but he also knew the police had permission to search his files any time. A lot of people did not want to talk to the reporter, because they felt he might reveal their names on purpose or through a slip of the typewriter. They were defenseless people, and they were afraid. The reporter never urged them to talk, because he understood their fear. Others, however, did talk to the reporter, precisely because they felt powerless, and wanted somebody to tell the truth they knew. They accepted his word that he would suffer imprisonment before telling their names. The government became very annoyed at this reporter. They questioned him directly about his sources, and, of course, he did not respond. They bugged his home and followed him wherever he went, and they searched his office and they tracked his phone calls. Finally, the government got really angry and said, "You can't write about us anymore. You can't have access. Go away." But some of the people about whom he had written, and whose names he had never revealed, kissed him when he went away and gave him roses, and everybody said he was a hero, and later he was loaded with honors. I was the reporter, and the beat I covered was Communist Poland. That was the first time I had to operate worrying about police and courts, and the first time I had to burn notes and think about going to jail. I thought it would be the last, because I resolved never again to work in a totalitarian society. Now, it is 20 years later, and I am the editor of the same newspaper for which I was a reporter in Poland. I spend my time dealing with news and with staff matters. But there is one subject that now takes up a considerable amount of my time and thoughts, and that has to do with whether reporters should burn their notes, whether they are going to go to jail, what are the possibilities of a sudden police search, whether people who once talked to us will talk to us anymore, whether other papers can be fined out of existence, whether the police will secretly commandeer our phone records to find our sources of information, whether we will be allowed to cover the administration of justice, how to get the police to reveal necessary information. New York, not Warsaw. I do not tell you all this to imply that we have gone totalitarian or that the republic will fall, but I do tell you that the process essential to a free press, One of the institutions that will help guarantee we do not go totalitarian, that the Republic will not fall, is under attack. And not from our enemies or the enemies of freedom. That we could handle. No, it is under attack from some of the very people whose professions have helped create and strengthen a free press. Some of the lawyers and judges of our country. Honorable men and women who traditionally have been our philosophic allies of the free press. And it is under attack from federal legislators and politicians who certainly do not see themselves as enemies of a free press. They just think the American free press is a little too free for their taste. They want to prevent the press from printing certain kinds of information. They say that, obviously, this does not affect such respected newspapers as the Times or the Washington Post or the Boston Globe. All they're aiming at, they say, is certain nasty fringe publications. Now, I happen to agree that some of their targets are indeed nasty and fringe. But it is precisely the fringes, not just the center, that the First Amendment was designed to protect. Simply see what has happened in the past few years. A dozen or so reporters have been sent to jail for no other crime than trying to protect their sources. Exactly what I did in Poland every day, and for which Americans praised me. Others are now under orders to reveal sources or face jail. The courts have permitted newsrooms to be searched. Thousands of memoranda and files have been subpoenaed in different actions around the country. One large newspaper, our own, has been fined hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now every small newspaper lives under the threat of being fined into bankruptcy at the decision of a judge. Laws erected by state governments to protect the reporter's right to work freely have been destroyed by some courts. Many judges have decided that reporters can be barred from essential parts of the court process, pre-trial hearings, which constitute so important a part of the administration of justice. Other courts have placed severe restraints on participants in the judicial process, preventing press and public from finding out what is going on. A wall of judicial protection has been built around information held by the police behind which they can operate in relative secrecy. In more and more cases, courts have upheld the principle of prior restraint. That is, preventing the press from publishing what it feels should be published. Until a few years ago, this was unthinkable. And in case after case, by demanding notes and files and sending reporters to jail for not revealing sources, courts in effect have ruled that they have the power to enforce publication of what reporters and editors feel should not be published, because the information is either confidential or simply inaccurate, untrustworthy, or damaging to innocent people, just raw material. In totality, courts now have ruled themselves overseers of essential decision-making processes of the free press that the First Amendment was designed to safeguard from government encroachment. What to publish, when to publish, how to operate, what to think. I do not think there is a plot against the government on the part of the courts. I do think that there is a resentment against the press that comes from many things. I do feel that most of that resentment comes from the virtues rather than the failures of the press. The unpleasant virtues of telling the people the truth about Vietnam, Watergate, corruption in government or in business, the aggressiveness and cantankerousness which are part of our makeup and function. We annoy the hell out of people. We have our faults, by God, we have our faults. There are scores of publications I wouldn't read, let alone work for. And there are a few for which I have loathing and contempt. But there is a difference between resenting the press, or even loathing it, and trying to control it. The First Amendment was written not to protect the press from the admiration of government, but from the loathing of government, all branches of government. Courts and the press are involved, it seems to me, in two philosophic differences. One is that some judges feel that it is incumbent upon them to protect what the government says for the national security of the United States. National security usually turns out to be a matter of political or diplomatic interest or plain embarrassment. The price of prior restraint, a fancy way of saying judicial censorship, strikes me as a very expensive price indeed to save government face. Remember what the government said would happen if we published the Pentagon Papers? National calamity, revelation of state secrets, disaster upon disaster. The government position was a fraud, and the government, I believe, knew it. As Judge Harold Medina once put it, any judge who knows his business and who has a stiff backbone can afford a fair trial without any invasion of the freedom of the press. In that speech of his, Judge Medina laid it pretty heavily on judges who he thought violated the First Amendment. He also laid it pretty heavily on reporters and editors and publishers who were too quick to compromise. He gave them a piece of advice: fight like hell every inch of the way. Well, we are fighting, and it seems that almost every time we turn around, there is a new battle to be fought. One had to do with the seizure of the telephone records of our Atlanta bureau by the Department of Justice. They were not investigating us, they were investigating the Ku Klux Klan, who we also had been investigating, without informing us or giving us a chance to fight. Southern Bell bowed to a subpoena of the Department of Justice and turned over all the records from our Atlanta bureau and from the home of our bureau chief. The purpose of the subpoena was to find out who our reporters were talking to. This clandestine investigation of a reporter's work is a clear violation of the spirit of the First Amendment. I'm happy to say that that particular threat has been considerably eased. Because of complaints from the press and the bar, the Justice Department issued new guidelines that made unnotified seizure much less likely. The press is not asking for privilege. That word implies some special gift to be bestowed upon the press or withheld from the press at somebody's discretion, a judge or a legislator's or a policeman's. No, we are not talking about the privilege of the press, the right and ability and duty of the press to function in any meaningful sense. Yes, this all concerns editors, reporters, and publishers, but I beseech you to consider that this concerns each of you as citizens of a country based on freedom of thought and expression. Every individual American has to ask himself or herself some questions. Do you want a society in which newspapers have to operate under the fear of being fined to death? Do you want a society in which newspaper offices can be searched without advance hearings? Do you want a society in which the public does not know what is taking place in vital parts of the court processes? Do you want a society in which the police process is made virtually secret? Do Do you want a society that is the totality of all these things? Please think about it. If your answer is, no, I don't want that kind of society, then fight like hell every inch of the way. Okay. As for some commentary, mine on this after reading it. Right, so he talks about his time in Poland, where he's walking around, interviewing people, being questioned, and he has to talk to people whose names he can't mention, who he does not want the government to know that he's talking to them, because he's giving out information which is bad for the government. Right? Now, whether this is good information, bad information, true information, false information, whether these are enemies of the state or freedom fighters or terrorists or who knows what, the point is that government says this certain speech is bad. This reporter is talking about this speech. This reporter is repeating this speech, and we want that speech to stop. Okay? So this is something that, every group, not just a government, but like every group deals with. You want people to talk. You want people to investigate. You want people to find out things. You want information to disseminate throughout the society, throughout the group. And so if you're in charge, you want to control the flow of that information. You want to say, oh, I say this, and then everybody hears exactly what I said. Right? You don't want there to be a middleman, right? Which is why you have government giving interviews, for example. You have the president giving speeches. You have politicians giving speeches. You have notes being sent out. You have official government reports so that they produce the information and they control the spread of that information. Like who interprets that information, because that's the other part of giving out information, interpreting it. So we have two sections here, right? Access to the information, disseminating the information. Oh, and interpreting, so 3 parts, and interpreting the information. I'm getting a little scattered here. Pulling this up on the fly. Okay. So he's warning that the process essential to a free press is under attack, and not from enemies and the enemies of freedom that we can handle. No, it is under attack from some of the very people whose professions have helped create and strengthen a free press, some of the lawyers and judges of our country. Okay, so let's think about the First Amendment. There are 2 reasons for the First Amendment, right? One, of course, is the right of the people to criticize their government. And it is arguable, of course, that to criticize the government, you must know what the government is doing. If the government controls all the information you get, then anything bad they do, they're going to make sure you don't hear about. This is, for example, what happens or what may be happening. I'm not there, I don't know, but I imagine in some place like Russia, when you hear, oh, Ukraine's attacking us, right? Well, if that's all you hear, then of course you believe it. You don't have any information to the opposite. If you grow up hearing an idea in your head over and over and over again that, like, I don't know, this certain politician is always a liar, or this certain political party is always trying to deceive us, or this political party is incompetent, or this famous person, say, I don't know, George Soros or Elon Musk, right, depending on what side you're on, is funding some group of people that's trying to do negative things, and so they must be bad. And every time I hear that I name or an idea for the next 30 years, I'm going to say, well, they're funding it, so it must not be good because they funded this bad thing that I heard about when I was growing up, or that I read about once. And they may have done good things as well, but if you don't even know that, then you can't judge what's happening, right? You don't know the good and the bad. You just know what somebody told you. So in order to arrive at truth of what the government is telling you, you want to have multiple sources. These sources may all be saying the same thing, and if they are, then that's it's collaborative information. But if they're saying something, if they're saying different things or giving different interpretations, giving different spins, then that says that there's something more complicated here. Like there's a possibility of complications. And we're not even talking about, truth and falsity yet. We're just talking about how do you know the government is telling the truth? Well, you want to have multiple sources of information coming from the government. So you want, the president's office to have a means of talking. You want Congress to have a means of talking. You want the senators to have a means of talking. You want the chiefs of departments to have means of talking. You want protection for whistleblowers so that the little peons in the department can send information out and not, lose their lives or get fired because of doing that. And that's just to ensure that there are multiple sources of information. But the other idea of free speech is that certain information is harmful, right? So we have free speech so that we can find out whether the information is good or bad, harmful or unharmful, right? If the police say, so-and-so people of this group or this race or this ideology are dangerous, well, you want to know if that's true, right? Or you can say, if the police say, well, there is not a serial killer in our town, well, you want to be able to verify that that's true. So you want access to the information that is not controlled by one source, right? Information, it's not just about freedom and truth, it's about harm, okay? But what else can cause harm? Lies, or even just mistakes, misinterpretations. So if the judges are shutting down free press because of what the free press is saying or who the free press is talking to, and the idea is that what that press is doing is creating a harm. Now, something like, who are these people talking to? That is obviously not a harm. But in no conceptual idea is, who is your source important to whether your information is harmful or not. Okay? What is important to whether your information is harmful or not is A, the content, and B, the truth. Okay? So you may have good reasons for investigating a piece of the free press, for investigating a report or a speech given or a article published. Yeah, okay. An article published or a YouTube video shot. So you may have good reasons for investigating that. And you say, well, you revealed so-and-so's name or you gave such and such information and that was false information or that was information that harmed somebody, right? This is why we would protect victims' names in assault cases because, they might suffer because if that information is released. This is why if you have a suspect in an investigation, you don't release their names until they've been charged with something. Ideally, you shouldn't release their names until they've been found guilty of something, is what I would say. Right? But, if you say, well, we're investigating so-and-so, what you're actually doing in that case is accusing so-and-so. You're saying that we have information that indicates this person is not just of interest, but this person is someone who we suspect of doing the activity. So we might say, what the idea here is, the police or government officials in general should be more careful about what they say and who they implicate as enemies of the state or enemies of their movement. But as it regards a member of the press, right, as it regards a newspaper or a YouTuber, a podcaster or a radio broadcaster, a book writer, you may investigate them for, either harm they caused or untruth. Okay, so let's say a newspaper releases the name of someone who is under investigation for a crime, hasn't been charged, but under investigation. Now, that might be harmful, and it might also be untrue. But those are separate actions. Those are separate causes for maybe investigating what's going on here. And in many cases, especially, in the modern day, that information is solely reputational. So you can sue them. You might have an individual suing a newspaper or a TV show or something for defamation, right? They're saying something that is not true and which harms you, and which you say, I should receive financial remuneration because of that, or at the very least a public retraction of the statement because it caused harm, it did something bad, and now I am owed restitution for that harm because they have violated the idea of not only the duty of the press, but the point of free speech is inherently to open up information so that information can be verified as true or false. And the point of free speech is to increase the amount of true speech out there, or increase the verifiability of a certain fact of information. If 30 different people from different parts of the country at different economic levels, who do different jobs and who are receiving information from different places, are saying the same thing, then it's likely either true or at least has strong support for it. There's one of those things I said was very interesting, right? And all getting information from different places. So how do you ensure that? Well, you could ensure it by investigating all their sources and saying, well, they're getting all their sources are different from other places, or different from each other. So that increases the verifiability. But if all their sources happen to be the same source, if it turns out that national news reports on XYZ happening, and you have 30 different news stations, all sorts of YouTubers, all sorts of people reporting on this, and it all comes back to one report by one newspaper in a small town in the country who, as it turns out, may have an agenda or may not have done their information correctly, but this is now a national level event where hundreds of groups are reporting on it, then something may be suspect there. And so you want to investigate that. But by doing so, by investigating that, you are opening up other avenues of danger, right? You're saying, well, if I can investigate you to ensure the truth of what you're saying, and if I can investigate your sources to verify that, then what happens if one of your sources says something I don't like? Okay? And that's where the problem arises. That's where the issue really arises. Is that you can make arguments which suggest and have which give you good reasons for doing pretty much anything you want, right? There is an argument, there is a reason, there is an idea here for investigating sources. There are reasons someone might want to know that, legitimate reasons. But there are other reasons as well, which obviously would be, I want to know who you're talking to so that I can shut them up. I want to know who you're talking to so that I can threaten them to make sure they don't say this again. I want to know who you're talking to because I'm the government and what they're saying is harmful to the government or is against the government's point of view or is insulting to someone of power in the government. Oh, it doesn't have to be the government, right? It can be insulting to someone of power. Maybe they insulted somebody rich. Maybe they insulted the Pope. Someone famous, someone honored. Maybe they're reporting that, what was it? Thomas Jefferson had slaves and had a slave child, and if they're doing that today, it's not of much interest to us, right? But if they're doing that in 1782, then someone up there, someone powerful, someone who has a voice, who is rich, who owns another newspaper, has a vested interest in stopping that from happening. One of the ways to stop that from happening is to go up the source, because you should theoretically be able to say, well, I can stop that happening by saying that I have a source and my source is something different, and I can verify what they're saying. And look, this guy over here isn't willing to reveal his sources. He isn't willing to talk about it. The person who is defaming me is saying this, but can't give any proof. They talk to a mysterious person. Well, I talked to a very public person. I talked to 50 people, in fact, and here's the information, here's the openness, right? If you are being lied to or being lied about, then you can defeat that lie by opening up information, by saying, I can beat your hand of a 6 and an 8 of clubs with my pair of kings. I want to reveal my hand now. I want to reveal the information I have and prove you false. Then I'll ideally sue you for defamation and so on. So what about when the government does this? Can the government sue for defamation? Can the government sue because a news organization printed information which was harmful or untrue? Now, theoretically, yes, right? Theoretically, there are legitimate reasons for this. There are fines that should be given. Perhaps the government should run these people out of business. But of course, the problem is, well, A, proving that, and B, who decides, right? You do not want the government to decide, because then the government becomes judge, jury, and executioner, right? And there may be an argument here for differences between like the judicial, legislative, and executive branches, which may be something you could talk about and measure, right? Like if you have a governmental system such that these three powers of government are antagonistic towards each other, then you might have a claim there on the government, in big scare quotes, not being judge, jury, and executioner, but merely being claimant and judge in separate forms. Separate people are deciding this. But how do you ensure that, right? How do you ensure that the judicial branch is actually antagonistic to the executive branch, for example? That becomes a much more complicated problem. That becomes a problem of governmental activity. That becomes a problem of who puts these judges in there, who decides whether to remove a judge or to keep a judge in. Who pays the judge, who investigates judges who do good things or bad things, and so on. Well, if you want to know that information, you need a free press who can investigate the government who is doing that. Because otherwise it's all behind this big veil, at least as far as the public is concerned, and you don't know whether or not the judicial branch and the executive branch and the legislative branch are antagonistic to each other, or whether they're all in cahoots. People getting little pats on the back under the table if, well, we like this particular judge, so we're going to judge shop in his district, and we're going to make it known that we would be very happy for this particular judge to be elevated to the next level. We would like him to be an appellate judge. The government looks favorably upon him. We have, the big ticket judgments we do in that jurisdiction under that judge. We get him in the news. the governor comes on and says, Judge so-and-so has done a fine job in this issue. Yeah, or Judge so-and-so has done a terrible job in this issue. Oh, and here's his address or something. Leaked on a forum somewhere. How do you know if the government is lying? You have a press who can investigate the government. And we come back to the same idea, right? So if the government can find media organizations out of existence because they have printed information which is either harmful or untrue, then I would argue that it ought not to be the government who does that. It ought not to be the government who finds these organizations out of existence, because the government has an interest in finding organizations out of existence which cause harm to the government, right? Because that harm may be to the government's point of view, to somebody in politics, to the honor of a department, for example. Just reporting on waste in the military might be harmful to the government, might reduce public trust, might entangle the government in lawsuits. It might reveal certain, what do you want to say? Not treaties, but agreements. God, what's the word? Certain projects they're working on, or certain contracts they've signed, which they ought not to have signed, or which they ought to have signed, but even talking about them and figuring out why they were signed is a big complicated issue, and the public getting involved is just going to muddy that, and now we're 3 years behind in our new plane design because we had to spend a bunch of time talking to people and explaining what was going on. We got called up before Congress, right? If you are the military designing a jet, maybe you don't want the press talking about that jet because it can put crinks in the project, and now you're behind being investigated. Sure, you don't even have to be investigated. Maybe just you call it before Congress and you find that annoying. Maybe someone is asking questions and you're like, okay, we answered that in a subcommittee meeting 6 months ago, but let me drag it out up here. And, and that's 2 weeks that we're spending on that. And then another 2 weeks here, another 3 weeks here, another 4 months here on this issue because someone reported about it, but we've already solved it. I'm just taking the good view. The bad view is, oh no, somebody reported this and it's fraud or it's illegal or something, and now we're all in trouble. But really, we're aiming to protect the United States. We're doing this for the good of the nation, and that could be a sheriff in town. That could be a politician, of course. That could be somebody doing paperwork. That could be somebody working on a religious project, right? That they can tell themselves they're being harmed by this information, and harming them or harming their activity is causing harm in turn to the public. Therefore, such reporting should be shut down, right? You don't even have to be evil to think this. You don't have to be, some totalitarian, horrid, putting thousands of people a day in the gulags sort of system in order to think that maybe we should tone down some of what the press is saying about me specifically. Maybe not others, but me specifically. And you get enough me specificallys in power in such a situation that they can do something about it. And all of a sudden you have a group of people and you have a movement where everyone is acting independently, but they find other people who agree with them. And now we're passing a law to limit the expression of the free press and limit the usage of the First Amendment. And hey, maybe that's as far as it goes. Maybe that's the issue, right? There was harm caused by this speech, and it's real harm, and we mobilized over it, and we stopped that harm. We're done. Until, of course, the next harm, and the next harm, and the next harm. It never really stops, right? Because every time, Who gets into politics and says, you know what, things are perfect as they are? Right? And either way, you're messed up there, right? Because if you say things are perfect as they are, then reporters talking about that is adding in new complications, new information into the equation of normality here and causing problems. And if you say, well, things are not fine as they are, then you're going to think, well, there are things should be better. And so I think that this sort of reporting is supporting some sort of reporting is supporting my activity to make it betterment, or this point of view which makes things better. So I'm going to prefer that reporting over the other reporting. And maybe the other reporting, the bad reporting, quote unquote, goes a little bit too far, so I got to stop them. Right? And it just goes a little bit far and far. These are just bits and pieces and maybes and mayhaps, but there's a lot of bits and pieces, a lot of maybes and mayhaps, a lot of ways things could go wrong. But, the question arises, of course, if you have, as he says, there are scores of publications I wouldn't read, let alone work for. And there are a few for which I have loathing and contempt. Okay, you have bad publications out there, no doubt. Lying, cheating scum who are pushing a point of view with no regard for facts, or who are just straight up lying in order to become infamous so they can sell you items, or who are funded by some mysterious shadowy organization or shadowy billionaire and aiming to oversaturate a market and drive other newspapers out of business so they can take over the news and decide what is disseminated as information or not. There are bad groups out there. So how do you know which ones are bad and which ones are good? We, the public or the government or anyone, might be able to tell which ones we think are good and which ones are bad for us, right? Which views we support, which views we don't support, which ones we think tell the truth mostly, which ones we think tell lies mostly, which ones we think actually want a betterment for the world, which ones we think are, some cultish nut. We can decide that, but it turns out people are going to decide differently. So we're going to have a mainstream where most people think that these 2 or 3 organizations are pretty reliable. And we're going to have a fringe where, they start getting less reliable as you go along, until you go, that thing's wacko. But there's someone out there, of course, who says, well, no, your fringe is my center. They aren't wacko, they're telling the truth. They're revealing the aliens among us. The lizard people who rule us secretly. Or, the politicians who are aiming to take over, or the billionaires, or, the anti-gender specific religious death viewpoint ideas, pick something. And there's going to be someone who thinks that's just fine, and someone who thinks that's really bad. But remember what I said about multiple sources of information? To decide whether a organization is good or bad, you want multiple sources of information about that organization, right? You don't want just one person, one judge saying that organization is bad, we're going to shut it down. You want multiple people deciding. So the government may very well be able to find something out of existence, but you don't want it to be one fine. You don't want one person or one judge to say this organization has done this much harm, and so we must find it out of existence, right? You don't want that. Either they cause so much harm that it's criminal and they're all going to be arrested, or they haven't gone that far, right? And it's somebody can sue them for it, or they caused a delay in a project, or they embarrassed a politician, or they caused a riot, right? Which is bad. But do you want them shut down because of that one information, right? You want smaller fines. And now the government may be able to find them out of existence, but you want it, I would argue at least, you want it to be several small fines that add up over time, right? You want this department and that department and that department and this department to find them for different actions, different activities, or for one department to find them for the same activity over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? Like, this organization keeps lying about these situations, so we're going to fine them, $1,000 here, $1,000, $1,000. Hey, they do it every day, right? These fines add up. Maybe you can make an argument they can be fined out of existence for that, but you do not want them to be fined out of existence for one situation, or because of one decision, because there are many reasons why someone might make that decision. You want multiple sources so that you can corroborate the information and determine its validity or invalidity, its truth or untruth. And of course, bad organizations should be punished by the market. That's the idea of the capitalist market, at least, that these organizations are punished not by the government, but by the people, which is an interesting little side note, right? The claim of something like a communist or a socialist government is that they are the people, so they punish the newspapers, their detractors, and it's the people punishing their detractors. It's the people deciding, therefore they're in the right. When in actuality, if the organization needs money to survive, then in a capitalist system, the people who spend money determine whether or not that organization survives. If other organizations keep reporting, hey, this is a bad organization, they're lying, and here's the proof, then over time that organization should lose trust, and other organizations should be trusted more, and one of them will survive, one of them will not. But, it's one of those interesting bits, right, where a capitalist, well, not necessarily a capitalist, but specifically a private ownership capitalist organization with with equitable distribution of wealth, right? Because one other problem that we can have is you have a billionaire who supports an organization. Some billionaire owns an inordinate amount of wealth and is able to prop up an organization over time. Now that billionaire is punished because he's not receiving any income from that organization, and his money is going down the drain. But if he has enough money or enough returns from other sources, returns which are magnified with the growth of his capital, and he's a billionaire, so he has plenty of that, then you may have problems, right? I said it's somewhat equitable distribution of wealth. Well, if one person can decide against 100,000 other people what to do or which organization survive, then you have a problem. So the other side of that, of course, is suing an organization out of existence. This happened I was reading an article on Kotaku, I think, where they had released, or one of their parent organization at a time had released information on, I want to say Hulk Hogan. And then Hulk Hogan sued them and ended up suing them out of existence, and Kotaku was sold to somebody else. And they bought themselves, and they sold again, and they bought themselves back, and now they're under some I don't remember how it ended. But the point was, that one person had essentially decided to sue them. And again, we don't want that to be the case, unless some horrid harm has been caused, right? And again, not reputational harm. Because reputational harm is something you can recover from. Do whatever you want, right? In 20 years, not a lot of people are going to care about it. In 20 years, not a lot of people are going to remember. In 20 years, it might still be haunting you, but it's not going to affect your daily life in most cases. So I'd be wary of the ability to sue an organization out of existence because of reputational harm. If it's physical harm, on the other hand, someone died, you lost an arm, then you might have a point. Like what's the price of a life? What's the price of living without an arm? This is something that's going to affect you for the rest of your life. And if this organization caused that sort of harm, harm that is irreconcilable, and harm which is unforgettable, and harm which is immediate and horrific. It's not just mental pressure necessarily, but some physical event is something I would feel more confident about suing an organization out of existence, especially a news organization. Okay. So we also have a problem today as we enter the modern age. I would say that one of the issues we have is a centralization of news. All right, there are fewer small newspapers, more newspapers which are large and owned by one group or one organization. What, like Fox and MSN, NBC, the three off the top of my head that I know, major news organizations. You have, the LA Times, New York Times, that you might read in all over the place. But like I was up at my grandma's and they had the Garberville Gazette, which had been running for something like 40 years. Well, it's out of business now. They couldn't keep it up. There wasn't enough money. And, that's a decision by the public to not support this newspaper, to not give money to the newspaper. And, there may be a decision maybe pressured somewhat by a government decision, by a fine given out. But, but in that case, well, they were given such and such a fine. Well, I better support them more because I think that fine was wrong. Because it's the idea. Of course, problems might arise. For example, if you don't have disposable income, like if the economy of the area is super depressed, people just don't have money to give to buy newspapers, for example, or to give to the newspaper, and maybe you can't support that level of public service. And that's a whole new problem. Right? There just isn't enough money for this. And there might also be too much money, right? It might also be that your small news organization, local news organization, is bought up by someone bigger and bought up by someone bigger and bought up by someone bigger until all that's left are the big people, the big centralized people. And what you have then is the appearance of multiple points of view, but really the number of points of view, the number of sources of information has shrunk dramatically. Right? If you only have three major news organizations, then none of those news organizations are entirely trustworthy because we cannot verify what those news organizations are saying if they are the only sources, right? Because what we're going to have today is these large organizations, in order to economically survive, they're going to take differing points of view. They're not all going to report on the same thing in the same way. They're going to report on the same information in different ways and give different spins on it in order to capture a part of the market and differentiate themselves from their competitor. So if you have a market area, especially in information, right, where you have a few large competitors, then either those competitors are all going to look the same and be identical to each other, and just happen to have different working capital and survive in an equilibrium, or those organizations are going to all be different from each other and giving differing points of view, which means that you have more radical points of view. You have less space in the middle. Now, today, I'd say that the space in the middle is being covered, well, the space in the middle and as well the spaces on the ultimate fringe, as always, is being covered by small organizations, small groups. Less scrappy newspaper and more podcaster YouTuber, right? Like a group of 1, 2, 3, 10 people maybe who spend time and investigate a certain issue or a certain idea, who have the time and the support to go and investigate government reports, to go to China or Taiwan and figure out how graphics cards are being smuggled, that sort of thing. Right? Which is, a big newspaper may have an interest in doing that, but where's the money in it, right? It's a small piece of information, and they have to get people over there, and then if they upset the government over there, then that government or those people might attack them in other ways, and they're really huge, so they're not just taking a hit like, this one project we did didn't work out. It's this one project we didn't work out, and now the government isn't talking to 50 other projects we have working on. You have more to lose. The bigger you are, the harder you fall. You have more to lose when you're big than when you're small. Because when you're small, you always know, hey, I could start again. It might be hard, it might be difficult, but I can get back on my feet. We can fire 2 people. I can sit by myself in an office and give the information and work with it, because I have an audience that supports me, and maybe I just have to take my effort down to the level of support that I'm receiving. But if you're a big organization, then you turn more frail, right? I can take my level of activity down to a level to the point at which I am matching my support. Well, that might involve firing thousands of people. That might involve reducing your complexity, especially. Now, you can't do 50 projects. Now you can only do 12 projects, right? Because of the scalability of that. There are lots of little ideas, but and reasons why that might work out. But today we have this rising force, which I feel like it is still rising, right? Of these smaller, independent news organizations, which I feel are generally more trustworthy, right? Like if I watch something on MSN, and I watch something on Fox News or whatnot, I'm going to say, well, let me go and look at four YouTubers and find out what's actually going on. Like, what's the actual information here? Like, let me look at someone who is focused on this specific issue or knows about this specific area, right? Who has spent time, who has spent years building trust with people, who is willing to talk about, certain sources or certain methods they use and so on, right? And I find that, a YouTuber might be more open with that. Sometimes YouTubers lie. Sometimes the information you receive is false. Sometimes the information you receive isn't true. And then it's quite easy in that case to move on, right? You click a button, you type in the search bar, and you move to a different YouTuber who you trust more. But if you have a TV, it's a little harder, right? You only have a small number of news organizations. And again, it's not the name of the news organization, it's who they're owned by. So you might have your local, reporter in, the Sunday Times of Castle City or whatnot. But if they're owned by, if they are a subsidiary of the subsidiary of the subsidiary of the, Murdoch Foundation, or of, the New York Times, or, some other group. I don't really know how the ownership structure works out. I just know that the number of news organizations is getting fewer. Right. Well, then they're suspect, right? If they're owned by a larger group, then their content is controlled by that larger group, or at least their content is strongly pressured by that larger group which owns them. Because over time, they'll hire and fire people they like, not people who give information they don't like. They're going to have they're going to differentiate themselves in all markets, because now we have a national market, not just a local market, for information and news. So putting out a newspaper has become more expensive, but putting out a YouTube video is very cheap comparatively, so it's easier for that to be started up and revved up. Plus, there's more space there, right? There's more competition, which means that there's this pull out for, there's this pull for truth, verified information, which is the purpose of the First Amendment, which is why we have a free press in the first place, so that we can have many different presses. Okay. And so to end here, as I've gone on for a while about this little topic. Okay, he mentions 5 questions. So question 1, do you want a society in which newspapers have to operate under the fear of being fined to death? Not really, right? I would like a situation where a newspaper which tells the truth, or a newspaper which does not tell the truth, or a newspaper which causes harm, will cease to exist over a period of time. I don't want them find out of existence immediately. I want them brought down over the course of a couple months or years as better organizations replace them, or they follow better methods and improve their abilities. Okay. And then second question, do you want a society in which newspaper offices can be searched without advance hearings? Okay, so 2 things there. I'm not sure exactly what he means here by advance hearings. I would say that he probably means that a judge has to sign off and give a warrant for these newspaper offices to be searched, right? There must be someone who says there is a pressing need for this. But it may also, he talked earlier about, the seizure of the telephone records of our Atlanta bureau by the Department of Justice, and they had a subpoena to do that. Right? So a judge had looked at, I think that's how a subpoena works, at least. So if a judge had looked at the information and said, you do have the right and the ability and the cause to raid this newspaper office, then I think that is also somewhat questionable. So it may not be, what the searching of the newspaper offices. It may more be the usage of the information. But of course, if they're after sources, then you can't take that back. Like, the police department has found out who your source is, and now they may have burned the papers, but they remember, and they might have a little talk to them on the side of the road with a couple of the dogs. But also, of course, if you want to prove, for example, that a newspaper or a news organization is lying, like a news organization is intentionally telling falsehoods, or a news organization is being funded by a foreign government, for example, then yeah, you want to be able to raid their office and investigate. So there are reasons to do so, but the reasons I would argue are few and far between. Like what is more likely? The your local newspaper revealed some fraud by the mayor's office, or your little local newspaper is funded by, I don't know, the Germans. Who knows? It's much more likely that the newspaper just pissed off some politician. But of course, the bigger the office, the more questionable it is, right? If now your newspaper organization is, the New York Times, well, you want to verify they're not being funded by the Russian government. But I mean, again, if it's something that big like the New York Times, then presumably there's a lot of information around there. And enemies of the New York Times, other newspaper organizations who are competing with it, would have an interest in investigating its sources of funds. So there are other groups who could do that against, large, powerful organizations. So either the organization is so small it's not really worth bothering with, or the organization is so big that it's hard to hide anything, nefarious going on. Or the organization is in the middle, rising up and is, receiving questionable, interesting sources of funding. Like how did you hire 30 reporters off, when 2 months ago you had 3? How did you get all these influencers to start talking about your brand when you just started up this company, 2 weeks ago? What do you, as far as, it looks like you spent $3 million and you have an income of 30,000. So where did that money come from? Right? There are points where a investigation may have reason to be made, right? There are reasonable ideas here. Searching for sources, I would argue, is not one of them. It's sources, searching for, I would say, sources of funds, or for, sources, or for the knowledge of that organization when they're doing harm. And that would be part of a criminal investigation of the organization itself, right? So he talks about, they were not investigating us, they were investigating the Ku Klux Klan, who we had been investigating without informing us or giving us a chance to fight. Okay? Okay. So, if you are investigating someone else and not the news organization, then that should be no reason to, raid the news organization, because there's a proxy here. Only if you are a criminal investigation of the organization itself, which is a high bar to reach. And I mean, ideally, the organization should also have a recourse against, like, unjust prosecution or police harassment. Should be able to fight against that and probably sue the government for their actions, or sue the police department for their actions. I think is something which should also be done, right? You want these activities where people can threaten each other to be reciprocal, so they hold each other in balance. Okay, and then question 3. Do you want a society in which the public does not know what is taking place in vital parts of the court processes? Well, obviously, no. We want to know what's going on in the courts. We don't want secret courts. We don't want secret decisions. We don't want sealed opinions. We want the judgment of the Justice Department to be clear and open and honest and obvious at every single step of the way, because justice is easily miscarried. Now, that being said, there are, it would appear, reasons for information that should be kept silent, right? Like, if you are handing information over to a grand jury and the grand jury has not decided whether that is enough information to prosecute them or not, then maybe you don't need to know, right? You don't need to know what the grand jury has been given or not given. You want to know whether they have passed it along for what the grand jury has passed along for prosecution, because they may have said, no, you can't prosecute this person. You don't need that information. And even admitting that the police tried to prosecute them but didn't have enough evidence is, potentially defamatory or harmful to them in some way. That being said, once they've passed that level, once they are under prosecution, then every single step of that way, I would argue, should be open and clear. Trial hearings, pre-trial hearings. And I understand why juries aren't open. Like, the discussion of the juries, once they go into the back room and have to decide an opinion. I understand when that's not open, because then the jury members might be targets or be mocked, or but I mean, if I was really being honest and open, I would have those discussions be public record as well. Even to that point, every discussion, every word said between a lawyer and a judge, every piece of paper passed. But I tend towards a view that, the more information, the better. So that's an argument which could go either way, I think. In that, certain information should be quiet. Lawyer-client privilege and what the jury is saying to themselves behind closed doors, and information that the judge is not allowed to be talked about in the trial, and so on. Like there are good reasons for that. Mainly, from what I understand, because our justice system is based around this adversarial idea that everyone can be counted on to lie and cheat and do their best to game the system. So instead of the court finding the truth, quote, truth, unquote, whatever that may be, the court is more of a yard duty between two kids fighting. Okay. Then question 4. Do you want a society in which the police process is made virtually secret? Well, no, obviously. But of course, the police would like that to be so, right? And that's one of the, that's something a little more interesting. I would like every decision by the police to be open. I would like, to know why was this person prosecuted, or what led you to make these charges? Who was in charge of the investigation? How is the maybe how is the investigation going? What was the decision process for doing this thing or that thing? Like they decided, here to raid the news organization he worked for because they were investigating the Ku Klux Klan. And I go, well, what was the discussion? What was the decision, and why was that decision made to raid the newspaper office? This isn't something that should be talked about quietly behind doors. Any organization, especially something like the police, is going to say that they want information kept quiet, they want information kept on the low down, that they will handle their own problems internally, because getting outsiders involved just makes a mess of things, that they don't want to release information about ongoing investigations because that might gum up the investigation and cause problems. Information might leak. False information might leak, which would be much worse. But as a member of the public, someone who is not a police officer would be, in most cases, either, attacked by the police, someone under investigation, or someone who is being protected by the police, so they are investigating a person who has done harm to me. Then I would like, in the first case, all information of the police to be open because they're prosecuting me. And they're, my enemy in this case. Or I would like all information open because I want to know how their protection is going, right? Are there any problems? Are they going to decide to do something differently? And so on. So I tend towards opening up information, but that does reduce effectiveness in certain situations. So we don't want the police process. We don't want the police process we don't want the police actions to be secret. That is most definitely not. The police process is a little more complicated depending on which part of the process you're talking about, and depending on which point of view or which sort of effectiveness you're headed towards. Okay, and finally, do you want a society that is the totality of all these things? Well, I mean, when you put it like that, of course not. I would not like a society where after 30 years of newspapers being fined to death, you only have 2 newspapers surviving, which are both pro-government. I would not like a society in which the newspaper offices are searched willy-nilly. I mean, who decides what's a newspaper office? Hey, if I start a YouTube channel, maybe they can say, oh, you gave information that was false, so we're going to investigate you. And that means we have to, take your computers and look at the hard drives, and hey, we'll get them back to you in 6 to 9 months. Good luck with that. All right, you don't want that. Do you want to, and I don't want a society in which the courts are opaque, right? Where you can't tell what's happening, where person goes into the courthouse, Judgment comes out of the courthouse. You never see the person again. You don't know why they decided. You don't know the discussion. You don't know any pressure that was put on it. You don't know the facts of the case. Like, you don't want that, because then you have no way of judging whether the courts are good or bad. You have no way. And if you have no way of judging whether the courts are good or bad, then you cannot differentiate the bad courts from the good courts, which means that one of the other of them is going to win, but you won't know which one. If it's the good courts, fine. If it's the bad courts, you're in trouble. Your entire civilization, your entire government is in trouble. And that's really what this whole issue is about. Right? It's little bits and pieces which sort of knock away at the foundation of a society with a free press. Now, we are doing that to ourselves, I think, in some way, by not supporting the small newspapers and the small investigative teams like we used to. But we are fighting against that in another way by shifting the maybe not focus, but shifting the source of news to smaller individual groups. So it becomes, we have the issue of aggregation. Like I don't have a job, right? So I can spend an hour and a half on the computer looking at 3 or 4 different YouTube videos, and I can go grab a book and read about archaeology or philosophy or history, right? And then, come to a judgment about the information I receive. But a lot of people, I think, don't have that. Or a lot of people are tired, or a lot of people want to do something else with their lives, or they just don't really care that much because it hasn't affected them so far. And, the world is changing as it goes away. The more short form content is good sometimes. Focuses on, gives you the main points within a minute in flashy letters that attract your attention so you're not zoning out. But you also lose a lot of nuance. You can't judge the quality of someone's information by one short. You need to watch a dozen or 20. And by that time, you may as well have just watched 2 or 3 YouTube videos from different creators and decided which one sounds better. So the time differential to find out whether someone is a reliable source or not hasn't changed very much over time, I would say. Or at least not over the time since the advent of Google and searches. Back when you had to walk the streets and buy 4 different newspapers and then read through all of them and then talk to people, it may have taken you a few more days. Now you can do it, generally speaking, if you're well educated and somewhat well read, you've been online for the last 10 years and you're just old enough to get that, have collected this information, you can judge whether someone is a good or a bad source, usually, if you have access to multiple sources to compare them to, which is the important bit. If you sit and you just watch one news organization, or you get your sources, all your news from one source, then you do not have a reliable source of news. Whether they are true or not, you don't have a reliable, robust source of news, is what I would argue. And so that's really what this freedom of the press is about, a robust and reliable source of news, so that we can verify the truth or validity of the information which we receive. And so it is not controlled all by one source, which would, in Rosenthal's case, be the government, who may or may not be doing what you think they are doing or what you think they should be doing, but eventually will, either today or 5 years or 20 years or 30 years from now, definitely at some point be doing something they say they're not doing and doing something you don't want them to do. So we're not just fighting for today, we're fighting for tomorrow and 10 years and 30 years in the future, when things are maybe a little more iffy and questionable than they are today. We want to make it's idea of protecting the First Amendment. The idea, the spirit of the First Amendment is protecting, is anti-governmentalist, putting a limit upon the powers of the state, because the state has such mighty powers and has historically, in most places, had the express interest of controlling news and information, where it is also the case that government is composed of individuals, and certain individuals have more power than other individuals. And we don't want that to happen. We want power to be more vague, more wave-like than point-like, as the case may be. I want the power of choice and voice and silence to need a large base in order to act. Yeah. I'm sure that made sense somehow. And I'm also sure I've talked way too fast and way too long. So I'm going to leave now and talk a little bit less tomorrow, but at least I feel invigorated and that I've given maybe not a good speech, but an active one.